So clearly, there's a debate going on about how China relates to China itself. But one thing that's clearly coming out of this is also the concept of how China relates to its surroundings and to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Uh, it's innate in the whole idea of factory to the world versus mall for China. But one of the terms that we hear a lot about, uh, and we always hear about it from the perspective of how a country like Pakistan or a country like the United States relates to China through the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Yeah.
And I'm a little bit concerned that we have talked about it so much all over the world, but I'm not sure there's a really clear understanding of what the Belt and Road Initiative actually is.
Yeah.
So I thought we'd ask an expert, and especially given that you've co-authored a manuscript, a book on the Belt and Road Initiative. Tell us in the layest of terms, what is the Belt and Road Initiative?
Absolutely. So first, I would say it's not just the rest of the world that's trying to figure out what is the Belt Road Initiative, or formerly One Belt One Road. The name changed in English, but it didn't in Chinese, Idailu.
Which is OBOR.
OBOR, and then now it's Belt Road Initiative, right? Which is when this manuscript came out, and through Rand Corporation, where I'm no longer working there, so therefore I don't really represent those ideas or interests. Whenever this manuscript came out, there was a lot of Chinese academics came to me and said, "Ivan, we really are interested in hearing what BRI is." And I said, "Wow, wait 1 second." So it's also some of the groups within China are trying to figure out what this is. At least nominally, Belt Road Initiative comes into existence in 2012, 2013, at the beginning of Xi Jinping's administration. It is, I would argue, at the very least, a narrative that has both international and domestic qualities to it. It is an international narrative. It is discussed as the revival of two economic trade routes, one being a land-based Silk Road, the original one beginning in Xi'an, one of the earliest capitals of China, and the second one being a maritime route associated usually with the Ming Dynasty famous sailor Zhang He, who.
So that's the belt. The sea route is the belt.
This is where it gets confusing, which is that the one belt is actually the road, and the sea route is the road, right?
Okay.
So it's a little bit of an academic joke to say that the belt and road as one belt one road is actually should be flipped, right? But both of them have this economic idea of reviving those trade, particularly in the near periphery, but extending all the way out to Africa, generally as a continent, to Europe, right?
But to Latin America.
So Latin America is not on initial maps of Belt Road, but certainly Latin America has become a very interesting transition. So I'm going to frame this as an understanding of the Belt Road Initiative first as a narrative at the international level, but also as a domestic narrative, which is it fits something I talked about earlier on, which is the China dream, a collective dream of national rejuvenation. And the idea is that Belt Road Initiative will not only solve some of those economic demographic shifts that are happening, or not solve all of them, but some of them, but it also showcases a national identity of an increasingly engaged China. I always use for an opening exercise for students, I talk about the word China in Chinese, which is 中国, which is technically translates middle country or middle kingdom. The idea of being at the center, not necessarily in a chauvinistic or an assertive way, but being at the center of trade in this context. Both of those identities can be happening at the same time, by the way. So there's a domestic narrative, there's an international narrative.
So the domestic narrative, I mean, that's really fascinating. So the domestic narrative is, hey, this Belt and Road Initiative, we can channel the Chinese dream through this instrument of engagement with the rest of the world at the outside in terms of how the state communicates with the people of China.
That's right. Yeah.
And also we can serve the Belt and Road Initiative as a pillar that helps forge a more coherent, unified Chinese identity.
Yeah, and I would say not necessarily a unified identity as a single identity, but a unified idea of
Idea of China.
of being a successful China, right?
Sure.
And then it fits a model of the reform and opening up period now needs to transition to not just how do we get out from being a quote unquote poor country, right? How do we now think of ourselves as no longer being a poor country, not necessarily a developed country, transitioning and interacting with others, right?
And not just poor to not poor or rich, but also peripheral to the rest of the world, to being central to the rest of the world.
Yes.
So that's the domestic narrative. Now, what about the kind of international narrative of the BRI?
Yeah, let's talk about a few different elements of it. First, whenever it comes out, I think it's worth looking at where first does Xi Jinping announce this. It happens initially in Central Asia and more robustly in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So as much as I do want to start pulling on the lines that have started to get drawn on the map to Venezuela or to Latin America or to even Western Europe or even further out into the Asia Pacific, I would say the initial near periphery were kind of the focus, right? And in that regard, also we can go back to Pakistan and talk about Pakistan at some point. But that long all-weather friendship or relationship with Pakistan is probably part of that too. But that was pre-existing, right? So isn't Belt Road a totally new thing, and all these interactions have fundamentally become more important to China? No, there have been existing interactions and existing relationships that are now being filtered through this a little bit. And I don't want us to get BRI lens or goggles, as I call them, right? Sure. Not everything is BRI.
Is there a sense of a retrofitting of a relationship like the one between China and Pakistan into a BRI narrative? Is that a proactive thing that's happening?
I get the sense that it is.
That's fascinating.
I would also argue that it's not just a state-led process in the context of, and here I have to be absolutely certain to say it takes two to tango, right? Which is to say this is not just China PRC exerting some sort of will, right? There has to be interests from the other side to get involved. An example of this where interest has started to pull back from Belt Road Initiative and from some of these overtures to Zhongguo, right? Our Middle Kingdom, is Malaysia, right? So just give that I'll bracket that example for now, but I will say it does kind of take two to tango. And there has been some retrofitting, right? And in fact, there's actually been some retrofitting, not just by the Chinese, but by those commentators that are anxious about the Belt Road Initiative. The Pakistani port that was developed by the Chinese. Govardhan, sorry, I apologize for this. So the port there actually constitutes, for me, an interesting retrofitting, which is that port project began a long time ago, sure, well before the Belt Road Initiative, right? I do want to say about where I do think that there are some new things that are existing, which are worth keeping an eye on, which is the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. And why I want to emphasize that is it shows both the global nature of it and the interaction between international and domestic narratives. So the AIIB is this new development or infrastructure and investment project in similar ways to, let's say, the Asian Development Bank, which is generally thought to be managed by the Japanese, based in Manila. And the idea behind it is doing projects to develop that infrastructure predominantly in quote-unquote Asia, right? The founding members, of which there are 57 of the AIIB, include countries all over the world, but you get some interesting representatives. For example, only from Latin or South America is Brazil, right? You have involvement from South Africa, so we're thinking about BRICS here, overlaps with. So you're starting to see institutional overlap go along with some of these narratives about development. And I do think that some of those relationships are being retrofitted and re-envisioned, not just by China or perhaps by Pakistan, but also by, let's say, the United States, which is sometimes very anxious about this Belt Road Initiative, which is to say, now here, a port here or a dam here is all about Belt Road Initiative, when in fact it might have a much longer history.
In that way, is the BRI in the international context something that's helping forge a version of China's ambitions by A, retrofitting existing international institutions and engagements that China has invested in, and B, identifying new ones. Yeah. So it becomes a lightning rod in a positive sense, because you're just putting things into that narrative to help explain it.
Yeah.
And then obviously in a negative sense for critics,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it says, hey, look how ambitious these guys are.
Yeah.
And they're calling this thing the BRI, but the BRI is really just the takeover of
everything. Yes, exactly. And in fact, I think that, as you could probably guess, neither of those are true on either end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
I would highlight that if we understand the Belt Road Initiative, where it comes from that domestic economic and political need of near periphery markets, of creativity and innovation having some export, not just occurring in Silicon Valley, so to speak. If we see that, and if we see that also being matched with the China Dream narrative within China, then all of a sudden the Belt Road Initiative is less about, oh, these are existing great projects, or these are existing takeover projects. It's more about understanding domestic politics in China and domestic economy in China. And there are other ways to interpret it, right? You could be looking at the high degree of which there is debt to percentage of GDP in China, and you could be talking about maybe the word that's gotten floated is debt diplomacy on the extreme side, but also in the sense of how do you now deal with an economy that is kind of has this debt crisis or issue facing it. And so I can see all of these playing in between that spectrum. Maybe some of them on the more sanguine, positive side. Maybe some of them more trending towards the takeover story, right? But where I really think we always have to come back to is the Belt Road Initiative is not just about what China wants to do. That's why neither of those necessarily make much sense to me.
Because it's really a partnership.
They're partnerships.
Collaboration, a series of collaborations.
And a series of collaborations and a series of we don't want to collaborate, right?
Yes. So autonomous decisions to opt in or opt out.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, on the one hand, it can potentially be a channeling of China's ambitions locally and domestically. Clearly, it also becomes a lightning rod for critics.
Yeah.
There's definitely an international aspect to it, although there's a lot of retrofitting.
Yeah.
I mean, that really makes the BRI kind of a dangerous everything for everyone, where people can just pile on in whatever way they want. I mean, one thing that would be fascinating is to learn a bit more about how BRI is talked about within China.
Yeah.
I mean, is it a big celebration of the great coming out party of China as potentially a global superpower, or is it more sober? Are there skeptical voices? What is the take on BRI within China?
Yeah, and I think that there have been shifting takes on it, right?
Okay.
I would argue that it did not have the kind of jingoism as or the excitement of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, right?
Okay.
But there's nothing like a big Olympic sports game and events to get not just China but any country kind of pumped up or nationalistic, jingoistic, whatever you want to call it. It also is foreign policy. I hate to say it is sometimes not as exciting, even though I study it, to publics than one might think. Right? It's not necessarily for domestic publics the thing that they latch onto, unless it's framed as something that's going to really benefit them. Right? And I think that the initial and continued framing is that this is part of the China dream, not exporting this dream to other places, but rather this is rejuvenating.
The fulfillment.
Or the movement towards not full fulfillment, but the movement towards an idea of being center of
a renewal of China's middle kingdom status.
Kingdom status, right? So it fits that. That's not everybody's going to buy that narrative, right? So it kind of fits that, but it doesn't solve again all of the domestic economic issues that might be more of interest for people, right? In terms of people, and here I'm going to kind of bracket it to our focus more on some of the scholarly stuff that's not just coming out of China, but it's being written by Chinese scholars or Chinese in general, right? I haven't covered all of the literature, but I have seen a range, not perhaps the range that we were just talking about in terms of lightning rod for absolute, perfect development versus extreme criticism and China takeover, right? Not in that kind of range, and that's somewhat to be expected, but more so in a range of what does this mean for different regions, parts of China? What does this mean for different sectors? What is this, is there a possibility that some of these projects might require more effort? And I think that actually links to the fact that, as you said, that it can be a little bit of everything, anything for just about everyone.
Clearly, China's neighbors and the countries in the periphery, or the countries in the neighborhood, China has a range of relationships. And again, from a Pakistan-centric perspective, we always take great pride in the kind of intimacy with China. Pakistan has been a great help and support and enabler of this story for China.
Yeah, and the
aspects of it.
Normalization relations with the
Exactly.
United States. So
Exactly.
I would even add, in that regard, serving to, the context of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up, I don't think occurs without normalization relations, which probably, in all likelihood, does not occur without that intermediary.
Sure, we were. I think Pakistan was critical to that opening.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's also critical to at least aspects of the BRI, notwithstanding the retrofitting aspect of putting CPEC in China, CPEC and Pakistan as part of the BRI. But before we get to Pakistan, I thought I'd ask you a little bit more about some of the other countries, and just again, because it's always great to have a scholar's perspective on sort of stereotypical ideas. Let's start with China and Japan.
Yeah.
I mean, these are countries that have historically kind of not gotten along.
Yeah, to say the least, yes.
How has China's growth over the last 30 years changed that dynamic? Japan's also changed a lot, and I mean, let's not litigate those changes too much. Yeah. But certainly China has changed a lot more in the last 30 years than maybe any other major country, just because of the rapid size of its GDP growth. Yeah. How has that affected how it looks at Japan, and maybe how Japan looks at China?
Yeah, and I would argue, and people can disagree with me if they want to on this, that not the United States, that the United States is not the other for China, that the other is actually Japan.
That's why I started with Japan.
And that's a historical process that goes back a long time, and it's not one that is purely, it goes before the founding of the CCP in 1921. So it's not about that. It's not about the current state. It's a long-standing one, and it's about actions from Japan's side too. But to bring it to contemporary, Japan and China have faced some pretty horrible times, even in the contemporary area. And I'm thinking about now 6.5, 7 years ago, in 2012, the last time when we saw the largest amount of anti-foreign protest in China against Japan with respect to the contested Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. The tensions were not even, they were beyond palpable. They were violence on the streets.
Was there mobilization of the PLA and?
There was not mobilization of the PLA or you're thinking about with respect to the islands?
Yeah,
there was mobilization.
Was there ever a threat of military sort of?
This is, I think, a debate that scholars are trying to figure out, right? Yeah. Which is that how do we mince and deal with the words and the amount of protests, which can be quite bellicose, with what actually is bellicose action. Sure. Okay. And how do we understand China as being assertive, or quote unquote newly assertive in this context? Sure. And I would, if you just reference those words, you'll start to see the debate within the scholarly community. But I want to go back. So in 2012, at least at the popular level, the tensions were extreme. Today, I mean, obviously the economic relationship sometimes gets compartmentalized and set aside as, oh, it's econ as usual. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think 2010 and rare earth metals can explain that. But the economic relationship remains robust, and there's been a little bit of a shift, even though Abe is, of course, rather focused, or has been rather focused on the quote-unquote normalization of Japan as a sovereign country, as having a security apparatus that
is its own.
That is its own, right? So beyond that, one of the interesting developments is that Japan has come out and joined the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank in this BRI initiative, right? And where it actually, if you believe in the development, this is a great development story narrative, where that actually fits is that Japan does a lot of the development work through the Asian Development Bank. And if these projects are really going to work, and so there is a big question mark as to what projects are going on, where they're going to happen, so forth, so on, and the transparency of some of them, let's say the ones led by AIB, where they're going to work is going to be in the same kind of neighborhood of where Japan and the ADB do their work. And if Japan and the ADB are doing their work in that same neighborhood, then you're going to see, and not just Japan, again, these
Sure,
are multinational.
but basically a development partnership.
It would either have to be a development partnership or something else, right?
And where do you think it's going to, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot in terms of a prediction.
No.
But it feels like China and Japan both, at least on the economic growth and development path, would prefer cooperation as opposed to competition.
It seems as though that's at least that, in the very least, that's the rhetoric. And I oftentimes say, whenever it comes to rhetoric, people say, talk is cheap. But in this case, I think talk might actually have some sticking power. Because if you talk, we're going to work together on this, and that these are not competing institutions, that if they start to have if they're not working together, then that means that those recipients can say, well, I thought you guys said that you're going to work together on this, right? So talk actually has some value, in my opinion, on this, or the rhetoric of cooperating. Okay, that's the way I would think about it, as a kind of analytically as a political scientist. That being said, it often goes back and forth between these two compartmentalized areas of nationalism in the Chinese kind of context and Japanese, movement towards becoming
growing Japanese identity.
And in this regard, I have to come back and say, this is somebody who's from the outside doing this, so yet another kind of white male perspective. So that's a challenge, right? But from I will bring in the U.S. here, which is where the U.S. has played this game under the Trump administration is both interesting and, for me, a little bit disconcerting. In fact, maybe even more than a little bit disconcerting, which is Trump's rhetoric on this is allies, particularly those like Japan and South Korea, they have to do it on they have to pay their own way, right?
So this is really interesting because the other country that I was going to ask about is actually South Korea, because with Japan and China, people generally know that there's an identity sort of complex there.
Yeah, antagonism. Yeah.
But with Korea, it's with South Korea. I want you to talk both about North and South Korea.
Okay.
How, again, over the last 30 years, and in terms of where they're at now, let's start with South Korea.
Absolutely.
What's the relationship like now, and where's it coming from? What's the original sort of what's the original sort of status of the relationship?
Yeah, so the original status is quite complicated because, of course, of the Korean War, which still is in armistice. It's not to say that a peace treaty is going to solve the issues, and the relationship with China has become more and more deeply integrated economically, and that's caused a kind of, I would argue from the Chinese side at least, a movement towards South Korea in that regard.
Like a softening.
Not only softening, but a sense that that economic relationship is really important, right? And I would even put that not just at the state level or the kind of we're putting quotes around China because China as a single entity is a big loaded idea on its own, but I would put that at the popular level too. Now, where things can again get complicated in a triangular relationship is whenever you add in not just North Korea, but the United States, okay? And why I want to mention this is that the last big non-street protests that I witnessed in China was whenever there was the deployment of the high-altitude thermal missile defense system, the THAAD system in South Korea, with U.S. support. And instead of it being protest at the popular level by people getting out on the streets, it was protest in terms of not purchasing South Korean products, so forth, so on, right? And
so like a anti-South Korea BDS movement in China.
What's BDS?
The boycott, divest.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So that happened, but since then, I think it seems as though things have gone back to the previous new normal, which was purchasing a lot of South Korean products, so forth, so on. But it showcases that China's relationship with South Korea has become economically closer. But at the same time, whenever some of these political security issues, not political economic, political security issues get on the radar, then you can end up with similar. Not to the same degree at all, similar responses, particularly at the popular level. So that's why I'm trying to draw a popular level
that's really
protest
fascinating,
story.
Ivan, because you talked about Japan and the U.S. came up as a potential both spoiler but also a bringer together, especially in the Trump era. And then, of course, with Korea, the context of North Korea and the context of the U.S. So basically a trigger. Both countries, the other really fascinating thing is that there's a populist element in terms of how China sees both these countries as the other, which is really interesting. And then the United States' ability to kind of land in the middle of that populist dispute and kind of stir it up and make things potentially worse.
Or push it this way, or push it that way, push it there, push it there.
Exactly.
And I don't want to give this as the U.S. is doing this with some very conscious idea about.
No, I don't.
And I don't want to even say that the U.S. is doing all of it itself, right?
A lot of this is just dynamics flowing.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So there's two other really fascinating countries, and as you can tell, we're moving our way from the sort of extreme east closer and closer. We'll get to where we are sitting right now, which is
let's do that.
Pakistan. But before that, two countries that really fascinate me. Maybe it's unfair to lob them together. But just to give you sight of where I'm headed, I mean, one is Vietnam. Because again, there's a Korean War context, and then there's of course Vietnam, which is a much more profound conflict, at least for the United States, but also particularly for Vietnam in terms of how much it changed or altered, and its original relationship with China, and what is happening today. So talk to me a little bit about Vietnam, and then I also want to move to Malaysia, but first Vietnam.
I'm going to use a moment in the summer of 2015 that for me, as somebody coming from the United States of America, was profound. The legacy on Vietnam is tremendous, not only in terms of U.S. foreign policy, and of course there's now massive comparisons to more recent U.S. Interventions, actions abroad, so forth. It also has a major domestic impact on U.S. politics. But there was a moment in 2015 that kind of made me catch my breath, like one of these moments where you're like, well, it wasn't so big, it wasn't that well hugely reported, particularly in the United States. But Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense, visits Vietnam in 2015, and the Vietnamese marching, I'm not sure what marching band of some sort of military background, maybe army marching band, played the Star-Spangled Banner. And you have to think to yourself, oh my God, that's big. It's a big change. It's a big change. And in fact, in that context, under Barack Obama, Vietnam and the United States developed a strategic partnership. And we should now say, who actually tends to do a lot of these strategic partnerships? Why? It's China, the PRC, right? China does strategic partnerships because in 1955 at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, China said, we are non-aligned, we are not with the US or the USSR, we are part of this third world, and which then of course changed and developed in terms of what it actually meant. And I use the word developed markedly there. We're part of this third world, and we are not going to do alliances, right? So instead, China's done a lot of these strategic partnerships. It happens to have one with just about every country in Southeast Asia. And Vietnam, going back to Vietnam, I would argue that this was a moment from the Vietnamese side, and again, I'm not a scholar on Vietnam, to say, send a signal. And I don't think the signal was purely to the United States. I think it was a signal to say that here is an actor that has been one on a very strong level. I don't want to use the word hegemon here because it comes with so many connotations, but has been a dominant actor at the international level since the end of World War II, but certainly since the collapse of the USSR. And this is an actor who happens to be in the Pacific Asia region for reasons that go way back to the quote unquote pretty little war of the Spanish-American War. The United States has been involved here, and now we are going to reach out to them. And that shows the complexities and to some degree the tensions that you see in China, Vietnam. Okay? Now, there is also a historical legacy to this. After the US, Vietnam, and I say war, but of course they even use that word war. The conflict in Vietnam is loaded because of the lack of congressional mandate. Because after that, China and Vietnam had a border contestation. So to say things have always been rosy and happy between Vietnam and China, that's not true. It's fundamentally not true. But that 2015 moment was a big one for me. I'd be reticent to say that 2015 moment meant that Vietnam decided that it was now going to become best friends, all fair weather friends with the United States. Certainly not. Certainly not.
But isn't that 2015 moment kind of an assertive? I mean, I use the thumbing my nose, but I'm trying to understand how it would have been read in China. Is it a tactical defeat, a strategic defeat? Is it whatever? Let them have their moment. Yeah. Is it, hey, good, there's more? Like, what was the response in China? To that kind of Obama opening with Vietnam.
I don't know exactly of that moment of 2015 because I was based in the United States doing both work and research there. I don't know exactly what the response was in China. I wasn't following it as well. My understanding is not that I don't think that it was thought of or framed of as a loss. Okay. I think that it was thought of or framed of as, well, we should be thinking very, very seriously about what our relationship is with countries in Southeast Asia, right? Sure. Where are there potential tensions regarding territorial contestation? Where are there avenues for a positive relationship? And I'm thinking here of not of Vietnam, but of Indonesia through some shared identity, ethnic Chinese, number of ethnic Chinese that came out and voted for Widodo, right? So in this context,
so it's really about revisiting its positioning. So the ethnic Chinese angle is a great segue into my questions about Malaysia. And I think a lot of Pakistanis have this question because in many ways, Prime Minister Mahathir and Malaysia writ large represent, I think a lot of it is misinformed, frankly, but there's a big kind of overselling of the great Malaysian story. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the Malaysian story, what's rather inconvenient is that Malaysia has been stepping away from China quite clearly.
Yeah, that's right.
Explain how and why that would have happened, especially given the ethnic Chinese, the power of the ethnic Chinese in Malaysia.
Well, let's take a parallel in the region and use Singapore, which has a huge number of ethnic Chinese and has that and I think I'll use a political science term here, it's very useful, a hedging approach to China, right? A hedging approach means that, and not just China, because we're back to, got to bring the US back into the story, right? Which is to say that at the same time as the economic juggernaut who you're looking at, only because of reform and opening up, and only because of some of these economic reforms is China. There's no at this stage, I would say, in my opinion, and I won't try and channel any of the representatives from those countries, there's no completely going away from China. So you said moving away, that might be some possibility in terms of, let's say, political relationships or security relationships or that kind of thing. But economically, I don't know unless we were
huge integration.
Huge integration.
Is it interdependence or just dependence? China's so big. Most countries wouldn't have an interdependence with China. I mean, the U.S. and China have interdependence.
Yes.
But can Malaysia claim interdependence?
Yeah.
Clearly, from what you were saying, South Korea and China also may be a degree of interdependence.
Oh, Japan also. So I would like to say that dependence I'd have to go case by case, but and that's not I know that sounds like a political science getting out of the question kind of move, but I think that it really is true. I would say for certain cases where there is a need for both a political relationship that you can move towards more interdependence. One of those I think would be something like Indonesia, but also Cambodia. The second, not just political relationship, but raw materials become an issue. So on the economic side of things, I think that plays a role in giving more of an interdependence type story. But third,
with respect to Malaysia,
Malaysia to some degree, yes. Maybe I'm thinking about Indonesia more in this right now. But yes. So those are two factors. But then the third factor that I think is really important is that interdependence doesn't just have to be either this kind of political interaction or economic one. It can also be what is your relationship with other actors in the region, right? Sure. And that can be through ASEAN, and that can also be whether this is whether people like it or not, the United States has a presence in the region, right? So interdependence can mean that China might still need you in some sort of form of greater regional activity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Speaking of making sense, one of the most sensible things that's happened over the last quarter century is the interdependence in terms of trade between China and India. And this, of course, is an issue that I think is studied reasonably robustly within India and within China, probably not seen as much in the US and in Pakistan, because both the US and Pakistan see the world too often in only strategic and military and security terms. But the China-India economic relationship, am I overplaying it? Or as an academic in China, is it something that comes across your radar as a visible thing?
Well, it certainly came across, I think, just about everybody's radar who looks at the general region of and I put quotes around Asia because of that, the contestation of how we think about what is Asia. But particularly whenever it came to border standoffs, what is it?
Doklam 2016.
2016.
15 or 16.
Yeah. So we're talking about two and a half years approximately, right? In that context, I would highlight then the subsequent, not immediately subsequent, but the subsequent Xi-Moti Wuhan conference, right? Yeah. Which is to say that just as they're at the same context of some security tensions that I've already made, I can make another parallel back to some of the examples that I've used before. It's the kind of same context of security tensions. It does seem as though those economic relations continue to be making that movement forward. I would argue that Moti was looking at China, and I don't think that that's necessarily as many qualms as one might have with Moti, and I'm not just meaning Moti. I mean in general, there's this kind of look at China, not just by India, but lots of different states because of the success story, right? Yeah. Especially whenever you take populous countries, right, like India, or extremely populous countries, to look at this and see not just how the success story worked, but where did it create some tensions, where did it create some problem. So there's a look,
but also where there's opportunity.
Yeah. And that was going to be my segue on India, which is that I would argue for the possibility of interdependence, which is both something that creates anxiety, but also can sometimes be a global good, right? For that sake, it will be really interesting to see to what degree India continues to have perhaps security tensions with China, but economic growth interactions, and even examining the model that China's built and building and transitioning right now.
So obviously that brings us to Pakistan geographically, but before we talk about Pakistan and China, the constant recurring theme, and we haven't talked about South China Sea because I don't claim to understand it at all. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that too. But I want you to just now zoom out. We talked about Japan, the Koreas, both North and South. We talked about Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia, Vietnam, and India. Yeah. And of course, there's other really important countries in the mix there. Certainly Bangladesh, I think, is critical. I think Cambodia is really important. I think Australia is an important, but we can't go through every country.
Yeah, that's right.
The one country that came up in every country's treatment was the United States. Mm-hmm. So here's my question. Is the United States kind of the disruptive actor that is watching this chessboard and making sure that everywhere China is, it makes sure that it has one little finger to poke it, or is it a totally different thing? Is it that the U.S. has had a long-standing presence in this great sort of, crescent of influence, including dropping nuclear bombs and engaging in at least 2 wars, and having a massive fleet, and establishing a strategic relationship with India and with Australia. And it's actually China that, through trade and economic growth, has taken the space of a finger and expanded it into a hand. So there's a Chinese hand in the middle of all these U.S. X relationships: U.S. Japan, U.S. Korea, U.S. Indonesia, U.S. Malaysia. Which one of it is it more? I know it's not one or the other, but who is the disruptor in this conversation? Is it China or is it the U.S.? My bias is obviously it's China's neighborhood. So this is really the U.S. kind of coming and poking its finger. But what's your take?
Well, so if you're going to make that argument, then you'd have to say the U.S. has been doing that for quite some time, right?
Since before China started growing.
Since before China's reform and opening up, right? Certainly, I mean, you don't want to give an actual date to it, but certainly, I would put it has to be a fundamental aspect of the Cold War, right? And in that context, it was fingers and hands, not of the U.S. and China, but fingers and hands of the U.S. and USSR, right?
Sure.
Right. So and this actually transitions a little bit back to thinking about some of Xi Jinping's writings on this, which is Belt Road Initiative is one of the 2 foreign policy initiatives of Xi Jinping that we talk about the most. What we haven't talked about that much, at least since 2013, 2014, is a new model or a new type of great power relations. So Xi Jinping his administration comes into existence, and not just like magically, there's a whole process behind it that we've talked a little bit about. And you have this Belt Road Initiative, and then you have this new type or new model of great power relations, which is a bilateral relationship between the United States and that of China. Which is to say, the old model of great power relations is that between the U.S. and the USSR, right? And that means that Xi is completely aware of this. The repeated line that you hear is that the U.S. and China should avoid the quote-unquote Thucydides trap, where a rising power, which is Athens in the Thucydides Peloponnesian War, will face off against a conservative declining power. Sorry, I should go down like this: a declining power of Sparta, right? I recommend that everybody takes a look at the Peloponnesian War and goes back and read it. In fact, I think Thucydides is actually critiquing this whole idea of rising and falling powers, so it's not purely that story. But very, very importantly, in that story, and people make a guess on this because I think they've watched the movie 300 too many times or something like that, and see the Athenians coming in and the Spartans losing, and Sparta wins. Sparta defeats Athens. The rising power is defeated by the conservative, militaristic previous power.
Status quo
power. Yeah. And this is a very interesting takeaway, and I agree. I hope that everybody who's listening and watching does not want any direct conflict at all, but particularly between the United States and China. The negative externalities of that the direct consequences are beyond imagining. The negative externalities are doubly so. Sure. So whose finger is playing with this, right? Well, in the very least, there's a recognition in China that this is the new dynamic, but it has a possibility of going back to that old USSR where it was really fingers pushing at each other.
And so there's an appetite to avoid that.
There's at least,
and it's explicitly stated by President Xi.
It's in the rhetoric to avoid the fingers pushing at each other, and for critics of Xi from the outside, from the West, from the United States, they say, oh, that's just cover for China reasserting itself in a region which the United States has an interest in because the U.S. provides a global good, which is that of things like freedom of navigation, right? You asked me to come down on more on this, right? I would argue that, in my opinion, I think that the United States' previous presence in the region and more recent so has pulled the United States into a kind of no exit, despite even the rhetoric of Donald Trump that we're gonna leave all of these partners or allies or whatever we've had in the past, right? So I'm not saying that it's impossible for the United States to not have its hand in the region. I'm saying instead that the legacy of the U.S. involvement, going way back, means
50, 60 years.
Yeah, means that the United States is always going to be there. And if you're anticipating,
but now it's been futurized, right?
That's right.
I mean, now you've got this, 5G and Huawei sort of thing going on, and basically the U.S. has I don't want to declare it to be legitimate necessarily, but certainly for the U.S., it sees itself as being legitimately threatened by a platform technology that is basically, in a sense, Chinese per se, and therefore actually encouraging its allies to resist the platform itself. I mean, that is a profound shift forward and escalation, if you will, in the nature of the competitive relationship between the two, is it not?
Is it I think we saw the seeds of it happening with ZTE. I think we saw the seeds of it happening with ZTE.
So it's just a gradual. It's the same path.
Yeah. Is it the same path? Because we might be talking about something that is going to be on a little bit beyond, and this is where I think we need to have this conversation, not just you and I, but with younger people. Understanding that younger people are perhaps...
Here I was thinking I was talking to younger people, but we got to keep going younger, I guess.
No, I think for both of us, because even though we have a very expansive idea about what the future is, some of the younger generations are thinking in ways that I hadn't encountered before. And I'll give you an anecdote just to explain it, and it comes from teaching, which I'm really passionate about, and I hope to convey that's something that I think is one of the ways that we deal with some of these issues. Teaching is a discourse type way of talking, not dealing, not solving, but discussing, right? So I talk about the modern state in one of my classes, and I talk about the history of empire and the history of civilization. I even talk about imperialism, and I talk about things like projects like the European Union. And then I ask, are there alternatives to some of these ones that we've talked about? And a student recently said, oh, the internet of all things, right? And I kind of took a step back, and I was like, well, as somebody who's so engrossed in studying the quote-unquote state or countries, this is really interesting. It's also a little bit scary, right? It means that access to avenues of interaction are just proliferating, right? And it means sometimes that we're going to have...
With no coherent governance mechanism.
That's the question, right? And I think the deep anxiety from the US is not necessarily Huawei, but the access to these communication technologies, right? And different places of the world, and I'm going to say places because I'm not going to talk about countries now because I want to maybe move beyond that. Different places of the world have come up with different ways either to regulate it or not. In the United States, even though one might say it's not regulated, which is a very, it's a favorite saying of the United States that we're going to deregulate that kind of stuff. It's regulated by private companies. We have to be absolutely aware of that, right? Things like social media companies, so forth, so on. Yeah. In China, it's obviously different, and that's where the issues come from, right? That there is a difference in the approach to how we regulate. Okay, and
that's profound, Ivan. Because what you're saying is, despite all this trade and all this interaction, all these opportunities for coming together and convergence, the internet represents one arena in which the starkness of the difference is really profound. In terms of how it's treated.
I think the starkness of the difference at this stage is profound, but the debates that are happening, I think not just we're talking about the idea of democracy or that kind of stuff, not just in kind of societies that rely on direct electoral voting, but happening all over the world. Those debates about how we interact with this kind of technology, those are starting to really, really get robust. They're starting. This is why the conversation has to be extended out into the audience, right? Which is that those conversations about how we interact with technology are starting to, in my opinion, like we said earlier, there are going to be horrific reactions against this. But if we live in this world of debate and discourse, I remain optimistic, and I'll tell you why, and I'll give, in my mind, another anecdote, which is that where I teach at NYU Shanghai is a place where students from all over the world come to interact, and they disagree, and sometimes they disagree vehemently and intensely. But in the end, if we have a space where we can go to this, we might end up with different regulatory approaches in different places, but we'll come back to this space where we can talk about what was the decision-making process behind it. And that's perhaps, despite for me some of my great anxieties about things that happen topically on a kind of newsfeed basis in the world, that's, for me, allows me to be a little bit more optimistic. I don't think I could handle it if I was always living in the tensions between this standoff or that trade war or this summit.
So on that optimistic note, perhaps we can talk a little bit about Pakistan. And again, I'd like to frame sort of my own take on the China-Pakistan relationship. It really genuinely is unique because it is so vividly mutually beneficial and so vividly not concerned with third, fourth, or fifth factors. There are doubts about that certainty that have emerged in the last few months. And the pivot point or the entry point for those doubts has been what we call CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which, as you rightly said, was really retrofitted into OBOR or Belt and Road. Is that really something that you see in China? Does Pakistan come up in conversations about China's relationship with the world? Is there an overemphasis at this end? And is there genuinely a threat to the China-Pakistan relationship, given the pressure that Pakistan clearly is under from certainly the West, to probably not be as generous in directing most of its contracts and relationships commercially in the direction of China?
So first, I should say I can't speak too much to politics in Pakistan. I also would. I don't want this comment that I'm going to say now to come off as saying that the China-Pakistan relationship is not an important one. But in the context of the U.S.-China trade war, that has been really, and this is one of those moments where something topical of the moment, at least theoretically of the moment, is really influencing a broader discourse or bringing a broader discourse within a place back to a relationship, right? I'm not sure if that means that there's an assumption from the Chinese side that Pakistan will, be a partner in perpetuity, going onwards, right, forever. So maybe my interpretation, at least, of this is that the U.S.-China relationship tends to dominate not just the news feeds, but also the discourse as to what China's role in the world is and how China engages the rest of the world. But also there might be a slight assumption that this longstanding relationship
can be counted on.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe that comes from I think it comes from a lot of different things. I don't think that that's necessarily a purely naive, we totally trust the other side type moment either. No, I think that I don't think it is. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship can't continue to be good and have its positive features. I do think that it is a good takeaway, not just about China-Pakistan, to say that one of the elements of being more globally engaged with things like the Belt Road Initiative, one of those elements is that, like you said, it becomes a lightning rod, and also it means that now you're going to be interacting and starting to deal with perhaps not just countries or regions, but areas that where you may not have the technical expertise, right?
And you may not enjoy the obedience and acquiescence of discourses that perhaps is easier to achieve in other places.
I think I would stick with just my first point.
Sure.
Because using international strategy to influence discourse and obedience is a whole like topic that I think we would have to do multiple sessions on, right?
Sure.
It's something that I think the United States was pretty deeply engaged in the context of the Cold War, particularly.
Yep.
And
is still engaged in today.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think that it's illogical or irrational or even
great powers seek to have acquiescence. Why wouldn't they? So I don't think it's a critical point that I'm making. It's simply that I guess I was agreeing with you. I think the BRI and the exposure to other cultures and other discourses will train the Chinese ruling party, the Communist Party, in how to deal with and engage with dissenting or maybe obedience is a strong word and actually has the wrong implications. But basically disagreeable environments, places that won't fall in line necessarily.
I would bring it back in a different avenue beyond, maybe dissenters or whatever you might put it. I'd bring it back to something that we can actually perhaps do a little bit of counting, and maybe that's too much of the political scientist in me, which is the number of overseas Chinese are now going to be in some areas where the security environs can be challenging.
Sure.
And so we already seen the PLN have to do rescues for Yemen, Libya, right? So these are examples where it's not those people are not there solely because of Belt Road. They're not solely there because of the state. A lot of the Belt Road projects are not just state-owned enterprises; they're also private enterprises, and so. In that context, having that set of overseas Chinese is invariably going to put China, ironically, in the position of what the United States has seen over the years, right?
But I think ultimately it'll be tremendously beneficial for China itself to have this constant jet stream of people going out and coming in, bringing the rest of the world back home, and taking a little bit of China to other people's homes. And I think that mobility, I've always felt that mobility is what makes us. I mean, you're an American, a scholar, working and living in Shanghai. I've been privileged to be born in one place and lived in multiple places, and the privilege of getting to talk to people in Beijing and learning from them. Ivan, this has been really an education.
It's fantastic.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you did this. I hope we can keep doing it. Thanks so much for joining
Fantastic.
Tabadlab Live.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks. All right, folks. Thank you for joining us, and hope you'll come back for more.